In this lecture, we're going to discuss the design process as it pertains to architecture. We're coming up on the end of Unit 2, talking about the profession of architecture, and this is really a continuation of the subject of architectural projects. And architectural projects, as we've discussed up to this point, are a process. All of the timelines and procedures that we talk about in terms of architects' responsibilities and construction and design are really all on a process. And it's not necessarily a linear process, meaning you do this, then you do this. Some things on the architectural project process are, but when we're talking about design, it's more of a circular process, meaning you have some ideas, you keep adding more information, you revisit those ideas, you refine them, you hopefully make them better, and you kind of keep going in this forward-moving yet circular type of process. The design process is also integral to any discussion about architecture and architectural design, because you spend a great deal of your time as an architect, and certainly an architecture student, in the process of design. And so because it's a practice, like the practice of architecture, you hopefully become better and better at making design decisions. And that's really what we're talking about, is how do you make design decisions? How do you continually strive to make things better and more refined along the way, along that process. When we talk about design and architectural design specifically, we're really talking about problem solving. And often we hear people say, well, in architecture school I did design all the time, and then I got out and started working and I feel like I don't do much design at all. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that when you are practicing the process of designing, that you are constantly honing your problem-solving skills. So whether it's a design problem or it's some other type of problem, that you can apply that same process that you would in design to kind of any architectural problem. So for example, if you are working a design problem and you're constantly revisiting it and you're refining it and you're kind of going through this process and this procedure, that let's say later on you have a technical problem or you have some building issue, you can apply those same techniques to resolve the issue. And so I think that when you become practiced and skilled at making design decisions and moving your ideas through the design process, that you become better at kind of problem solving in general. And so really that's all architectural design is. It's continual problem solving. And as issues arise, you're trying to solve maybe more minor issues related to a central design problem, or maybe they're major issues. But if you keep kind of working through these ideas and constantly revisiting them, refining them, getting more input, and making them better, then the end result is going to be a much more rich and studied thing than it would have been if you had just said, okay, well, here's my first idea for solving this problem. And if it's your first idea and you haven't really thought about it, not that the first idea can't be good, but if you haven't really thought it through, then maybe you're not really solving the problem. You're just trying to come up with something in response to the problem. So we look at that a lot in problem solving in terms of design. You know, are you really trying to solve the problem? Are you trying to resolve this? or are you just trying to come up with something so that you can be done? Hopefully it's not the latter. Hopefully it's the former. And hopefully that you are constantly kind of reworking your solutions toward the end goal of becoming the best possible resolution to the problem. Architectural design is also about people. Now, sometimes this gets forgotten a little bit, and the irony is that often when you see famous works of architecture or buildings that are photographed, they're people-less, which doesn't really make any sense because they are designed for people, they're made for people to use, and many of the design decisions that we make along the way as architects are influenced by not just all humans, but the specific humans who are going to be using the building. We also look at issues of life safety, sheltering people, preserving people's health. And so we have to kind of always remember that design is not necessarily this abstract, formal exercise, where architecture, while it can be sculptural, is not a piece of sculpture. It will be inhabited by people and used by people. Architectural design is also about the place that it inhabits. Sometimes we refer to this as place making or issues of place, but design happens in an actual place. It's kind of like people. We can't forget that people are going to be occupying the architecture, and the architecture is not floating in midair. It's not on the moon. It is in a place on Earth somewhere, and that somewhere has issues that are specific to that location. So that could be climatic issues. It could be issues of topography or geography, like in this photo. It could be cultural, place-related issues, maybe local customs and local traditions, and that really ties in to the issue of designing for people, because people will have characteristics of being human beings, but they will also have their own culture and traditions and practices and habits and behavior that are often very closely linked to the place in which those people inhabit. So place can have many different influencing factors, but we have to remember it's for people in a place. Architectural design is also aesthetic, and so when we're discussing how a building is going to be used, who is going to be occupying it, where it's located, we can't forget that we want it to look good also, but there are issues of form and composition, beauty, the rhythm of the exterior and interior elements, placement of windows, placement of doors, all kinds of things factor into the aesthetics of a building. And again, the place and the people might also be heavily influencing that, because whatever people happen to believe is beautiful in that particular culture or that particular location, that's going to have some impact on the aesthetics of the building. Because, someplace in the world, people may tend to favor a certain type of appearance or a certain type of look of buildings or even materials, and that may appeal to them. And that may not be the case somewhere else in the world. So these things are all interrelated, but they're all very critical components in terms of what the design can potentially be and what the overall design decisions will be made by the architect. Design for architecture is also technical. When we discuss the building as a whole and also the individual parts of the building, like all of the details that are, converging together to make this whole building, we need to look at issues of materiality and building science and comfort of the humans that are going to occupy this building. Again, if it were simply a piece of sculpture, it would be art only and not, worrying about fire protection systems and exit stairwells and whether or not the seals on the windows are tight enough or not tight enough, or the mechanical systems, whether that's going to make people too hot or too cold inside. So all of these technical issues come together and fuse with the aesthetics to try and make something that is both beautiful and also beneficial to the people who are going to use it. We get into issues of efficiency and, permanence and how long things are going to last and how well they're going to perform in that particular condition. So again, even technical issues, we're basing decisions based on the people who are going to be using it and the place in which it exists. This takes us to the central concept of an architectural design. And I think most architects would hopefully agree that the stronger your core concept with the design of your building, the better off you're going to be in terms of making additional design decisions. So if you can kind of early on, as you gather information about the project, if you can create kind of a strong central unifying concept, then every time you have both major and minor design decisions to make, you can kind of check it against your central concept and say, is this in keeping with my concept? And you can ask yourself kind of yes, no, and then it will help you to make some decisions. In architecture, we call this the partie, and this comes from a French term, and it essentially means, how you make decisions, or kind of the central concept of your decisions. So the partie is really kind of the unifying core idea of your design. Now, as you start looking at buildings and maybe even analyzing other people's work, it helps to know what their partie was when they created the building. Sometimes it's a little bit easy to tell if you're visiting the building, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes you might think, wow, I really like this building, but I'm not sure what their kind of core concept was in designing it. But as we were looking at that video earlier where it discussed different architects' design processes, there was a building, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia by Todd Williams and Billy Chen. They had this idea, and it was a really simple sketch. One side said gallery in a garden, and the other side said garden in a gallery. And basically their concept was this art museum is going to be very intense for the visitor because there's a lot of different art pieces, and if you were just to go into one giant room and put all these art objects in at one time, you'd probably be quite overwhelmed. And so they really thought about the experience of the visitor and had this idea that you would need some relief from the art as you're moving through the gallery spaces. And so their version of relief was to pull in nature and natural light and plantings. And so on some places they showed that they had actual trees central to some gallery spaces, and then in other places there's an actual garden or a split between the buildings, and then there are art pieces within that. So that is one of those great concepts where it's the idea, once it's presented to you, seems simple, but I'm sure that it drove very complex decisions, but it allowed them to keep coming back to that concept and saying, is this related to the concept? And a lot of times when you're in architecture school, it's hard to understand why professors will keep saying, well, what's your concept? You think, well, I don't know. So you don't really want to come up with the concept after the fact. I mean, it really does help you to create that concept based on information that you have potentially about the place and about the people using it and about the design problem. And even based on that initial information, a lot of times you can come up with a good partie, a strong concept that will drive all your decisions after that. So you don't want to get to the end, you're like, well, I guess my concept was whatever, because that's not really the case if it didn't really help you drive all those decisions along the way. In design, we also talk about meaning, and some buildings have more meaning than others to various groups of people. A lot of times we're talking about meaning on the side of the user. Now, there could be meaning from the architect that was, the architect tried to kind of imbue in the design, but oftentimes the meaning might evolve over time, or as someone approaches a building or moves through a building, they might have their own experience or connection with that building, and that might have particular meaning to them. So it has a lot of different kind of facets when we're talking about architectural meaning. This is a photo of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and it actually holds a lot of religious significance, but also cultural significance for Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and also the kind of cultural geography of the city and of the history of the region. And it really acts as a symbol for Jerusalem as a city and for the people who live there. And so I'm sure that people who not only visit it, but people who live there and kind of go experience the building, they might have their own meaning or connection associated with the building. Form is a huge part of architectural design, and as you see architects work and try and refine their process and refine their design concepts and the actual design of the building, formal issues are always very critical, because a lot of times the form, the mass, the volume, the shape of the building is really the bulk of the aesthetics. Now, you could factor in like materials and other issues, but the form oftentimes really reinforces what the building is. So this is the Air Force Academy Chapel in Colorado, and the form of this building is simple yet complex. So when you first look at it, it's like, okay, well, there are these repeating triangulated spires, and that's it, right? It's just kind of the same pattern repeated over and over. But because of the triangulation, both at the top and bottom, there are also these interstitial triangulated parts that stitch them in between. And then there's kind of this one almost seam that runs through on the two sides. And then if you're looking at it from the ends, you see this triangulated form that's reminiscent of many different types of chapels. But this is kind of a simple yet complex formal exercise, but also very recognizable. People who know this building, when you see this form, even if you see the outline of it or the shape of it, you're very well aware of what that is. And Form can also be influenced by the people and the place, but often the form is going to be driven by that partie, that strong, hopefully strong central concept that will allow the architect to make decisions with regard to form. Theory and history are hugely influential when the architect is going through the design process with regard to the building. So sometimes when you're looking at a building, especially a more modern building, it's not like you'll see literal historical references where you might not see a Doric column or some Roman reference to a building, but you might be able to tell that there's many layers of the architect's knowledge of history and theory incorporated into the building. And that's really what we're talking about, is kind of having that base knowledge of theory and history so that you know what architects have done in the past, what works, what doesn't work, and through your own practice you start to become aware of what works and what doesn't work. And the theory and history knowledge also help to drive those ideas of partie and the concept, because there might be, a fairly simple idea of architectural theory or even some concept in architectural history that you can kind of utilize to help make some decisions even with a more modern structure. Most new architectural projects that you're working on and design problems that you're trying to solve typically require you to do some additional research, and often that research involves studying some part of architectural history or theory that maybe you haven't looked at in a long time or you haven't visited before, and that can add a layer of richness and meaning and depth to your design decisions that you may not have been able to get any other way. Because the whole idea with the design process is that you don't want to become stuck. You want to be able to have ways to solve both minor and major problems that come up along the way throughout the design process. So sometimes, reading things or looking at additional buildings or historical buildings or really anything regarding theory and or history can often help. Case studies are things that we look at to maybe analyze a building that has either been built or designed or existed previously in some way. But a lot of times a case study will be almost like a picking apart of a building to examine all the individual workings and pieces of it, either from a design point of view or from a technical point of view. This is another way in which you can kind of analyze things that maybe you're trying to resolve in your particular design problem, and it might be a way of learning about new systems or new processes in construction or building science that you haven't yet come across or you haven't used before. It may even be that you are working on a new type of building that you haven't yet encountered, or maybe you haven't worked on in a while, and you can look at case studies to try and see what the current technology is on those particular buildings. So case studies can be hugely helpful in terms of making design decisions and kind of adding to your knowledge to effectively make design decisions as you go. Building typologies are, or building typology, is looking at kind of all the variations of a particular building type that you happen to be working on. So this one shows some isometric 3D views and plan views of all different types of apartment units. And in architecture, we just refer to that as multifamily. So instead of just saying apartment, multifamily describes any configuration of living units that are attached. And these are all attached in wildly different configurations. Some have towers, some have courtyards, some have terraces or penthouses. But looking at the typology of the apartment building kind of helps to sort out your own ideas about the project that you happen to be working on. Because sometimes looking at all these individual variations, it's almost like seeing a pattern altogether of the same type of building. And so often that helps to organize your thoughts about what it is that you're currently working on, and sometimes it helps to influence various schemes that you might be thinking about, or various variations on a particular design scheme that applies to your current project. Iterations are just different instances or different variations on the same project. So for example, if I were designing a building, and you see this in these models and kind of these broken apart little 3D pieces on this particular model, the iterations are all of the different versions of that design. So when we talk about something being iterative, and you'll hear this quite a bit, and I feel like architects love that word, iterative, but it just means that you are working through the solution to the problem over and over. And you didn't just come up with one solution to the design problem and then you said, yep, that's it, that's what we're building. You came up with many different variations and many different versions of it, and not just all at once, but you are refining and revising and kind of continually going through that design cycle to try and get to the best possible result or the best possible outcome. And that leads us to design thinking. Now, design thinking is a concept that you'll hear applied to all different professions and all different areas of study and, businesses. But really, this is what architectural design is. And this is not a common kind of procedural path in architectural design to teach these actual steps. But, design thinking is applied to so many different things in modern society, these kind of 5 steps, that I think it's a bit easier to kind of break architectural design down into these steps because it directly applies. This is what we're doing anyway. It's just that sometimes architects can't identify, like, yes, these are the actual steps that I'm going through. But there is an assignment that you're going to be doing where you're going to need to go through some design steps, and it's going to be very helpful to use these steps as a pathway for you to work through the problem instead of just staring at something and going, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. I've got this design problem. I don't know how to come up with a solution. Working through these steps is a great way to kind of guide you through the process, and hopefully as you do this, you won't end up in a kind of writer's block for architects stuck phase, right? So when we look at this, we have these 5 main steps. We've got the first one is to empathize, and just going left to right. We need to empathize with the person or people for whom you're designing. So this describes it as the audience. So again, it goes back to that idea that architecture is for people. And then we're going to construct a point of view that's based on user needs and insights. And so that's defining the problem, and it might not even be defining the architectural problem, but I think define, that is a great place to define your partie or your core concept, because at the beginning you're probably given the design problem with the user and the place, and so in the empathize state you start to begin to recognize the users and what their needs are. So when we look at that first step, empathizing could mean a lot of different things. If it is a culture or group of people that you are unfamiliar with, just doing a lot of research and learning more about how they're going to use the building, communicating directly with the users of the building, getting to know whoever the client is, to really get a feel for what it is that will be best suited to their needs. And so if you can empathize with the user, then along the way you're going to make much better decisions, because if you don't know who the users are and you're just making this building for some kind of unknown person, then your decisions aren't going to be as effective because you're not empathizing with their situation or their needs or ultimately what the building should be for them. So the second step is to define, and I would say here defining means defining your core concept, based on knowing where the location of the building is. You would know the location and place at this point. You're going to know the people and the users. You've talked to the users, you've communicated with them so that you can empathize with them and their needs, and defining the partie at this point is really critical. And that's because the problem has already been defined for you before that. So the problem was probably defined by the users thinking, well, we need a new building, or we've outgrown our facility, or we need to renovate, or we need to add on. So that the problem is kind of predefined. But defined here means you as the designer need to define what your concept for the project is going to be and what your partie is. And then the third step is to ideate. And ideate means just get your ideas for this project out of your head and onto some format where you can record it. Now that could be a piece of paper, a sketchbook, a notebook, a voice recorder, just anything where you're going to be able to just kind of let your ideas about the project spill out. You don't want to try and edit yourself at this point, because it's like no idea is a bad idea at this point. You're just trying to get out any thought that you have at all about this project. And then as you ideate a lot more, then you can start to kind of sort through the ideas like, okay, well maybe this kind of works with the concept that I have, and maybe this really starts to align with my partie, and this might start to organize the spaces and work for the user and things like that. So you ideate just, it's like a brainstorming session, and this could last a short time or a long time, but the idea is for you to really brainstorm a lot of ideas. And again, there are no bad ideas at this point, because even if something that you draw is either a hideous drawing or a bad idea, it's just on paper, and so it's no big deal. It's just part of the process. So when we get into our design assignment too, you really want to focus on the process. Don't worry about the product, especially at the ideation phase, because you're just getting ideas out and trying to brainstorm. Now, once you've ideated and you've gotten a bunch of ideas kind of out of your head, then you can begin prototyping. And prototyping in architecture means either making some models, making some drawings, maybe you make a rendering or a photo collage, or just something that starts to resemble some form of a building. Now maybe it's really rough at this point, but that's okay. That's the idea. And so as we look at different tools for design communication, whether it's a 3D representation or a 2D sketch or some kind of 2D, photo rendering, the prototyping just starts to represent some of those ideas. Now you could prototype all the ideas that you had done in the ideation phase, but that's probably going to be a lot. So you're probably going to start editing at this point and saying, okay, of these 50 concepts that I brainstormed or these 50 forms that I brainstormed, I'm going to try and make a model of 5 of these or 7 of these. And then you can see what they look like. And then maybe of those 7, you can say, okay, I think I've got 3 or 4 good ones and the other few are pretty hideous. So then maybe of those 3 or 4 that you think are the best ones that you prototyped, then you go into the last phase, which is testing it. And testing it for architecture just means showing it to the client, saying, okay, you're the user, I'm testing this out on you, what do you think? And again, you're in early stages, and they might say, I hate all of these, or I love all of these, or I like parts of this and not of the other. But you're not going to build what you've got in your hands at this point. You're just kind of going through the initial design process, and then what happens is, of those 5 steps, then after you test it, maybe the client says like, okay, I like this part of this, I don't like this part, but it's kind of back to the drawing board. That doesn't mean you throw everything out. It means you start refining and continually reworking those steps in the process. Now, you're not going to go back to step 1 to empathize with the user because you already know the user at this point. Probably not going to completely redefine your concept. You might, based on some information that you get, but you're probably just going to slightly refine or redefine slightly your partie or your concept. Mostly what happens is you keep reworking those last 3 steps in a circular way. You go back to ideate, maybe you do some more sketches, or then you prototype some of those. Maybe you just revise some of the prototypes that you made, and then you go test it again. You go talk to the client. You talk to the other architects in your firm. You're bouncing ideas off each other, and then you keep going back to the client to see what works. And so this process, is super helpful in terms of just continuing to cycle through instead of saying, well, I came up with this one thing and they didn't like it, so I guess that's over. That's not really how it works. You're constantly refining. You don't give up. You just kind of keep working through it. And, as you keep taking the rough edges off and continually reworking it, hopefully you end up with a really good scheme at the end of the design process. And then you take it through the rest of the kind of architectural project phases where it becomes closer to reality and construction.